The army that crossed the Potomac River in June of 1863 was by almost every credible measure the most dangerous military force the Confederacy had ever assembled. It had broken 3 Union armies in the field. It had turned flanks that experienced soldiers insisted were unturnable. It had marched men through mud and starvation and done it faster than its enemies believed was physically possible. Robert E. Lee rode at its head, and after Chancellorsville, even his most persistent critics had grown quiet. But something was already wrong. Not with the men, not with the rifles or the artillery or the particular ferocity that had carried the Army of Northern Virginia from the gates of Richmond to the banks of the Rappahannock. The problem was architectural. It ran through the command structure, through the intelligence apparatus, through the operational assumptions Lee carried north with him. By the time the army entered Pennsylvania, a constellation of conditions had been established that no amount of tactical brilliance could undo.
Gettysburg didn't destroy Lee's army across 3 days of fighting. The destruction had already begun weeks earlier in decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but fatal only in retrospect. Chancellorsville had done something dangerous to the Confederate High Command. It convinced them they were, in a sense, unstoppable. The battle in May 1863 against an army nearly twice their size was Lee's most audacious move. He divided his force in front of the enemy, sent Jackson on a flank march that shouldn't have worked, and shattered Hooker's confidence before he fully deployed.
The Union Army retreated, and the Confederacy celebrated as if the war's mathematics had been rewritten. Lee was treated in Richmond like a man above his era. His officers began to believe they could beat the Army of the Potomac in almost any condition. That belief became the first casualty of the Gettysburg Campaign, and it was already dead before a single shot was fired. When Lee moved north into Pennsylvania, he did so under real pressure. Virginia was exhausted, supplies were collapsing, the army needed food, space, and relief. A successful invasion could shift the burden of war onto northern soil, threaten Washington and Baltimore, and potentially fracture northern morale before the 1864 elections. But that plan depended on one critical assumption, that Lee's army would know where the enemy was at all times. That assumption collapsed quickly. J.E.B. Stuart, Lee's cavalry commander, was meant to provide that intelligence. He was brilliant, aggressive, and unpredictable. But after Brandy Station, his reputation was under pressure, and that pressure shaped his next decision. He issued Stuart orders allowing discretion. He could move east, screen the army, gather intelligence, and rejoin in Pennsylvania. But those instructions contained contradictions. He was told to stay close, but also free to ride wide. Stuart interpreted them aggressively. He rode east, captured a wagon train, and became trapped by his own decisions. His movements slowed, his horses wore down, and his return was delayed. For 10 days, Lee moved blind through enemy territory, unsure where the Union Army actually was. Reports from Confederate commanders showed growing anxiety. Lee repeatedly asked for Stuart, but no answers came. The system depended on trust, not rigid control. Lee gave intent, not detailed instruction. It worked only when subordinates could reconstruct his thinking under pressure. But Stuart chose action over obligation. What Lee needed was intelligence, not spectacle. He needed positions, movements, direction. Instead, he lost visibility. And that loss shaped every decision that followed. This command style had worked earlier with Stonewall Jackson. Jackson understood Lee almost instinctively. He moved with speed, precision, and alignment with intent. Together, they functioned like a single operational mind. But Jackson was gone. He had been shot by his own men at Chancellorsville and died days later from infection. Lee's reaction wasn't emotional language, it was structural recognition. He could not replace him. Jackson's absence removed the stabilizing force that had made rapid, decentralized command possible. After Jackson's death, Lee reorganized the army into 3 corps: Longstreet commanded the 1st Corps, experienced and cautious, often skeptical of Lee's aggressive plans. Ewell took Jackson's old 2nd Corps, large and capable but now under a commander untested at that scale. A.P. Hill led the 3rd Corps, talented but inconsistent in high command. The structure looked efficient on paper, but it introduced instability at the exact moment the Army needed coordination the most.
Jackson's former corps still carried his operational culture, speed, aggression, relentless pursuit. But Ewell didn't fully share that instinct. He had not internalized Jackson's decision-making rhythm. What had once been automatic now required interpretation. That gap mattered immediately. Longstreet preferred defensive strategy, arguing the Confederacy should force Union attacks on prepared ground. Lee rejected that. He wanted a decisive offensive outcome. That disagreement would echo through every major decision at Gettysburg.
The first major break came on July 1st. Confederate forces pushed Union troops through Gettysburg in what looked like a tactical success. The Union line collapsed towards Cemetery Hill. The high ground was exposed. Lee sent a message to Ewell, "Take the hill if practicable." Those 2 words carried ambiguity. Ewell evaluated the situation. His men were exhausted, his units scattered, and he lacked full artillery support. He decided it was not practicable. He did not attack. That decision changed the entire battle. By morning, Cemetery Hill was fortified with artillery and infantry. What could have been taken with relatively light resistance became a heavily defended position. The opportunity was gone. This moment illustrates the deeper problem in Lee's system. It relied on subordinates interpreting intent correctly under pressure, but interpretation varied, and in war, delay is often equivalent to loss. The Confederates had momentum, but momentum without coordination is fragile.
On July 2nd, Longstreet's assault plan faced delays. He argued for repositioning and alternative approaches. Lee insisted on the original plan. Hours passed in disagreement and adjustment. Movement was slow, and terrain forced changes in alignment. During that time, Union forces strengthened key positions along Cemetery Ridge. When Confederate troops finally advanced, they were attacking ground that was no longer vulnerable. The delay had closed the tactical window before the assault even began. The fighting at places like the Wheatfield, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top became brutal close-range combat. Confederate troops showed extraordinary courage, but they were attacking prepared positions with growing Union reinforcements. The coordination failure was not tactical bravery, it was timing. Units were arriving into battle at different speeds with incomplete synchronization. The Union Army benefited from interior lines, shifting forces quickly across shorter distances. Lee's army, spread wide, could not match that responsiveness.
Behind these failures was a deeper structural issue. The Confederate Army lacked the staff infrastructure to coordinate 3 corps at this scale. Lee's headquarters had been built for a leaner command system, dependent on personal understanding rather than formalized operational planning. That worked with Jackson and Longstreet. It did not scale. Orders were less precise than the situation demanded. Timing wasn't fully synchronized. Contingencies were underdeveloped. The system was being asked to perform beyond its design limits. There is also evidence that Lee's physical condition affected his performance. He had suffered a serious inflammatory episode earlier in the year, possibly cardiac in nature. By Gettysburg, he was under extreme stress, and witnesses described moments of fatigue and reduced clarity compared to his usual precision. While not decisive on its own, it added strain to an already overloaded command structure. A commander operating at reduced capacity, even slightly, has less margin for error in complex operations. By July 3rd, Lee attempted a final decisive strike, the assault on the Union center. The plan assumed that previous attacks had weakened the line. They had not. Instead, Union positions were stronger than expected. The artillery barrage preceding the assault overshot its targets and caused limited damage.
When Confederate troops advanced across open ground, they faced concentrated fire from elevated positions. The result was catastrophic loss. Entire divisions were shattered in minutes of exposure.
Pickett's division suffered devastating casualties. Command structure collapsed under fire. Brigade leadership was wiped out in sequence. What remained of the assault force fell back without achieving breakthrough. The failure was not simply courage or execution. It was a misread of enemy strength, position, and resilience, all rooted in earlier intelligence failures. Without accurate cavalry reconnaissance, Lee's understanding of the battlefield had been incomplete from the start.
After the battle, the Confederates retreated into Virginia. The Army of Northern Virginia would never again attempt a major invasion of the North. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently. The loss was not only manpower, though casualties were severe, but also opportunity. The chance to force political negotiation through a decisive Northern victory was gone. The war would continue under increasingly unfavorable conditions for the Confederacy.
In hindsight, Gettysburg is often treated as a three-day turning point, but structurally, it was the final expression of earlier failures. Jackson's death removed operational cohesion. Stuart's absence removed intelligence. New corps commanders introduced instability. Command coordination exceeded staff capacity. And strategic confidence, reinforced by Chancellorsville, encouraged risk-taking without full information. These factors accumulated before the armies ever engaged.
The battlefield itself simply revealed what was already in motion. Campaign outcomes are rarely decided at the moment of combat. They're shaped by organizational structure, leadership alignment, intelligence quality, and prior assumptions. Gettysburg reflected all of these interacting under pressure. Courage remained constant on both sides. What changed was coherence, the ability to coordinate action across time, distance, and uncertainty. Lee's army entered Pennsylvania already carrying invisible constraints. By the time the first shot was fired, key elements of operational effectiveness had already degraded. Stuart was absent, command structure was still adapting, intelligence was incomplete, and strategic assumptions were outdated. Gettysburg did not create these conditions, it exposed them. The outcome was not a sudden collapse, but the final stage of a system that had already begun to fail.